Very excited to have Greg Graffin, singer of Bad Religion, college professor of evolutionary biology, and author of his new book, Punk Paradox. This book chronicles his life from birth to growing up in Wisconsin, to moving to LA, to forming Bad Religion, getting his PhD, headlining the Vans Warped Tour, and everything in between. So if you contrast this with Motley Crue's The Dirt, this is the opposite. This is a guy who never drank or did drugs. And in the book, he mentions someone orders a Maker's Mark with Coke, and he thought it was a made-up drink. So while The Dirt was really interesting, I think this book is a little bit more relatable for people. And I thought it was a really interesting read and a story about perseverance. And I only get 30 minutes with him, so I tried to get as much wisdom from Greg as I could. Enjoy. The book, Punk Paradox, and it's called Punk Paradox because punk is about anarchy and fucking shit up, but that's not really how your life was as you reflected back, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I had a couple of years to think about it while COVID was raging. I sat around and reflected on my life. I think a lot of people did, man. I noticed it's like memoir season right now because it's a lot of people, spent that time, especially entertainers who are usually very active. We had 2 summers of inactivity and many months between them. Where I still felt like being productive. So as I reflected more, though, on my life and punk rock, I found many puzzles and many things that weren't that easy to explain. And it wasn't really a scientific exercise. I wanted to tell a story, a story about my journey from the Midwest to California. And the years before Bad Religion and how that helped to shape my toolkit in terms of the experiences and the skills, if you want to call them skills, of a teenager that I brought to the band. And the paradoxes are numerous. It's like as you said, punk is characterized and I should say stereotyped as having these crazy nihilistic tendencies and these, the glorification of fucking shit up and, anarchy and no rules. But that isn't exactly the experience that I had. And yet I think the stereotype is sometimes missing the point of what made punk great. At least for me, I gravitated towards the music. And you rarely see treatments of the history of punk that celebrate the great songs and the great songwriting. And I found some consistency in my academic upbringing and kind of the academic pursuit of songwriting. So it's really a memoir from memory. It's not a memoir from research. I didn't go and spend a lot of time researching. But because of my analytic brain, it is a fairly internally coherent analysis of not only my own life, but also sort of the early burgeoning of punk rock in Southern Cal.
Yeah. So what did it feel like to write this book and share something so personal? Did you worry about what other people might think? Like maybe some of the people that you talked about in the book, like would they get mad for you mentioning them?
I was definitely intentional when I wrote it. I did not set out to hurt anyone's feelings. And so if someone's feelings are hurt, they can simply blame my memory. And it's funny because you could say, oh, I take full responsibility for my memory. But everyone who knows anything knows that memory is flawed. Memory is not perfect. Mm-hmm. And that's why, sure, it came from my own brain cells, but I really was intending to write an interesting and lively story. And to do that, I use the resource of my remembrance. And because of that, you have to, anyone who writes from memory, you have to read the words on the page and recognize that memory is oftentimes flawed.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's funny. It's early in the book, and I'm just getting to know you. I mean, obviously, I know the band, and I'm a fan of your music, but I don't know you. Haven't seen a lot of interviews with you, and so I'm reading the book, and right off the bat, you're talking about this kid with a wooden leg, and I'm going, is this for real? Is he like joking around? Is this part of like the punk humor or something? And it was like, no, this was real. You had a friend who had a wooden leg. Now, why couldn't he have like a plastic or titanium? Like that just seems really. Is that a common thing at the time that people had prosthetic limbs would be wood limbs?
I think so, yeah. And I mean, the interesting thing about that story is that that kid who we knew when we were only in first grade or very young kids, he went on also to move to Southern California and became notorious in the punk scene. They called him Peg Leg Andre, but we didn't see him like that. We just saw him as this kid, from our neighborhood who we played with. And, he had a wooden leg was very common as a prosthetic back then. They didn't have the kinds of materials that they use today.
Huh.
And he was just a rambunctious little kid that we played with.
That's cool. Well, the other thing that's early on again in the book is you talk about how your parents got divorced. Now, I've had some experience with this working with kids at divorce, and it sounds like you were pretty devastated. Do you think that's kind of like an underrated problem in America right now that no one really talks about how divorce affects kids? Because it seems like it's something that we don't really mention as one of the major problems, but I saw it as a big thing that affects a lot of kids.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought it up because it's less important as an experiential thing for me, and more important that I used it as a device in the book to try to relate to people, because it is so common. Divorce is so common that most people, they don't dwell on it because they just, they don't, if something's that common, it must not be that traumatic, right? Well, I mean, and you say, well, I was traumatized by it. Well, I think all kids are traumatized by it. And the difference is that if you really want to seek to understand your own journey in life, and you just gloss over something like divorce, you're not really giving yourself a fair treatment. And so, yeah, I wouldn't say that it traumatized me to the point of incapacity, but it certainly determined, more importantly, it determined my emotional state in many ways, and it determined the course of our family. And therein, lies the storytelling aspect of it. So by ignoring that, you really shortchange your own personal journey.
Right. Well, and that's a big part of your journey, because this is so interesting to me. Is like what you did is you gravitated towards music because you felt like that was a way to please both your parents, because both your parents loved music, even though it was different styles of music.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying again, in storytelling, you try to be honest about what you remember. And, that was not, I have been to psychotherapy in my life, but not about divorce. It was, I guess it's something that it does seem like a therapeutic exercise to try to come to terms with, why did I gravitate towards something like music? But the truth is, yeah, it was always an important element in an academic household. And it was something that pleased both my dad, the professor, and my mom, the dean of learning skills. So it was definitely it explains very nicely how I became so interested in music.
Yeah, and I like how you had the balance. Like your dad was like Johnny Cash and Elvis, and your mom was like Stevie Wonder and Blood, Sweat, and Tears. But
Yeah.
Simon and Garfunkel, that one's interesting to me. You love Simon and Garfunkel. What are your thoughts on what Garfunkel added to the group? Because I think a lot of people don't know he was more just like the background singer, right? And he didn't even, I don't think he even wrote many or any of the songs. I know he sang lead on Bridge Over Troubled Water, but talk about his importance as a background singer, because I think that would later be a big part of Bad Religion, is the background, the harmonizing vocals. That was a huge part of your band.
Yeah, and of course, when I was first introduced to Bridge Over Troubled Waters, I was like in second grade and third grade going through this divorce. And that song or that album has a lot of lonely tunes on it. I think even though I didn't fully comprehend the lyrics, they really spoke to me and made me feel comforted because that was music playing in both households. And of course, I mean, I learned to sing to some of those songs, and I could even sing the harmony parts, but I didn't really, at that age, analyze what good was Art Garfunkel. You know, you're hearing this sonic, this sonic, so the sound was tranquil to me, and it was two voices harmonizing. So it made me comforted. And looking back on it, those albums and those recordings are classic. You know, later in life, I can analyze what you asked me about, like what was his value. And of course, those albums, like all albums, they're snapshots in time, and they're incredibly impossible to, I should say, they're incredibly difficult to judge how it might have been. Because from this perspective, you look at it as perfect. It's a snapshot of a moment in time. And would they have been so popular without the harmonies? I don't know.
Yeah.
And I think they were partners, obviously, and that's probably that transcends the partnership itself transcends the importance of each individual. So it's truly the sum is greater than the parts.
Absolutely. Yeah. It just reminds me of like later when you talk about, was it Brett that left because he did the background vocals, right? And then, so that was like tough. You had Brian come in, but he had to learn how to do background vocals. So that is kind of an underrated part of bands, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, harmony is, like you said, part of what makes Bad Religion unique. So
yeah.
We always loved it.
Absolutely. And then, so you talk about when you're a teenager, you just kind of you felt maybe a little bit lost. I think the quote, as you say in the book, having no excuse for laziness, I must have seemed like a louse to the academics and adults in my mom's circles. I didn't really care, but I did feel like I had to prove myself as worthy in some way. So obviously you eventually find your way and, you're fronting a band, you become a college professor. So what is your advice to people at that stage? Cause that's, again, I used to work with teenagers, and a lot of them go through that where they just are kind of lost. What advice do you have to teenagers to finding their way, or what advice do you have to parents to help their kids find their way? Cause I feel like that's an important part of the world right now, is helping kids find their path.
Yeah, I think my advice would be better to parents than kids, because parents often are too, they impose their will on their kids, and the kid, so the kid is like going to ask you, like, what should I do? Well, to be really, to make it easiest, you have to do what they want you to do, because breaking away from that, the rebellion is going to impose all kinds of problems in itself. So you're either restricted by your parents' demands, or you're restricted by the rebellion. I mean, so the real problem is the parents who are imposing their will on the kids. And I was very fortunate in that both of them. See, that's what I try, and I'm glad you brought it up, because what comes through in the narrative is that I call it, my family was, I refer to it as Graffin U. It was like a big university. It was like there was definitely a high expectation, but it was not forced or thrust upon us. And that gave us students at Graffin U the ability to find our own way. So it's hard for parents nowadays. You got to relax your expectations but it's so important, because then the kids will feel it incumbent upon themselves to to meet the standards that has been established in the household. And the in our case, my brother, as I said, he could always get the good grades, and he was always the math whiz. But I was pretty lazy academically, and I didn't feel like I could achieve those goals. But you know what? I was pretty good in sports, and I loved to play ball, and I was good at music, and those things gave me satisfaction, even though there was no viable way of like turning it into a career. And so I was, because of probably um, lack of lack of oversight, if you will, in the household, I was allowed to meet up eventually with these other slackers called Bad Religion.
Yeah.
And then together we were pretty industrious.
Yeah, but then you stayed away from drugs at a young age, and you discuss that more in the book. Obviously, people need to get the book. We're just touching some of the topics here, but what do you think the answer for that is? How do we keep kids off drugs? Because you never got mixed up in that stuff as long as your band went on. I mean, we have like a huge fentanyl issue in Arizona. I mean, I don't know what the answer to that is, like, but for you, you just never even seemed curious about it.
Yeah, you're talking to someone who's really when I was young, I didn't think I was such an outlier, but now, a little later in life, I realized that it's pretty incredible that I was surrounded by
Right?
hard drugs, and there's something in me that just never wanted to experiment with them. And I've gone on record before as saying I think I was afraid of them, because I was afraid of what they might do to me. I would lose control of my intellect, or I would, I had so few accolades as an intellectual anyways. I didn't want to lose what I had achieved. So I don't know what it was, but it's a very rare thing. And I also know, just from my study of biology, that a lot of those cravings and desires are genetic. It's well established that there's a material basis for a lot of alcoholism and a lot of drug addiction, and it comes down hereditary lines. And maybe I just avoided that by not getting the gene for it.
Yeah.
Certainly, my parents were not. They didn't drink. There wasn't alcohol around the house. I think that helped, but I just wasn't curious in any way.
Yeah, it worked out for you. Now, you also talk about when you put the band together, there was a lot of joking around it, and you would do impersonations like Tom Snyder. Can I hear like an impersonation, either a past one, or is there any more contemporary impersonations that you still do?
You're asking for like impersonations of guys on television from 40 years ago.
I remember Tom Snyder.
I could do anything, and people would still not know what the hell I'm talking about. But Tom Snyder was great, but he was a fellow Wisconsinite, and he had a late night talk show, after Johnny Carson. So he was the equivalent of the late show,
Right?
So probably, who's ever doing that now? I don't even know. I mean, Colbert comes on late, right? But those guys have the equivalent time slot of what Tom Snyder had, and Tom Snyder would have kind of the more unique guests. And I'll remember one time he had the punk band, or he had the first. He called them the first punk band, but I think they were just a group of guys from New York. Probably one of them it may have been David Johansen from the New York Dolls, but this was the 70s, and it was a group of punkers, and he would always smoke during his interviews. So there was smoke everywhere, and he would light up a cig, and he'd just ask the guys, "Okay, guys, why all the violence?" or something like really very, very pedestrian. But you really had to see his antics to really understand how out of touch he was, and yet he was extremely popular.
Hmm. Yeah. There wasn't a lot of options back. There wasn't a million podcasts and YouTube channels back then. So you kind of had to
No,
watch.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, so
Yeah,
then,
now you can. You're probably right. You can go look up Tom Snyder.
yeah.
Just type
No, I
in
remember
YouTube.
him.
You could type in Tom Snyder and punk and see what comes up.
That's awesome. Well, so then in the 80s, people kind of, a lot of the punk fans gravitated towards metal, you said, because of all the violence and stuff at the punk shows. But you kind of thought hair metal, or you not kind of, you did think hair metal was ridiculous. Do you still feel that way?
Well, let's make something clear here. I didn't think the music was ridiculous. I thought the fashion was ridiculous.
Oh,
I
okay. Because
I
I love the
actually
music. The
yeah, well,
fashion, you're right. I would agree with that.
I completely understand why punkers would gravitate towards it because the music, a lot of the music was good. It was not as or incisive. It wasn't as what I would say, charged with controversy as punk, but the lyrics sometimes were ridiculous, but the music itself was really good and fun. And so a lot of punk rockers who didn't want to get, go have a riot or go beat up each other, which makes a lot of sense. They gravitated towards the hair metal concerts,
Mm-hmm.
and it was totally understandable. I just couldn't, I could not find myself doing that. I still thought punk had a lot to offer, but it basically there was nowhere to play it because the clubs wouldn't allow punk shows because of the violence aspect.
Right. Well, and then you have a whole chapter here about selling out, because I remember that was a big thing. I remember that in the '90s. My friend who told me about Bad Religion the first time. He was very critical of bands if they sold out. And I remember like when MC Hammer, remember they said he sold out because he did a TV show or a cartoon or something. But now it seems like everybody has a TV show or they're acting or they have a million other things. Do you think being a sellout, is that even a thing at this point anymore?
I don't know if it's a thing anymore. I mean, uh, the concept itself was trivialized. So there would be, if a band that used to tour in a van all of a sudden now is in a tour bus, you'd be accused of selling out. I mean, that's just a trivial, almost nonsensical criterion for calling someone a sellout. So it became kind of trivial. But the concept of selling out, the integrity part of it, it's like if you give up your integrity just to be more popular, that is selling out, and that still exists. So I think the triviality has gone away, but there's still people who care deeply about integrity. And although you're right, it's easy to be cynical today and say there isn't any more integrity. But I think that aspect does live on. You don't just play music because it's popular. You play music because it's a part of you, and I think the fans can sense that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I mean, I really enjoyed the book. I just felt like at the end, I wasn't sure, like, there wasn't like a conclusion that wrapped it all up. Like, what do you think after all your life experience? Like, I totally respect your opinion so much because of like everything, your education and being a front man of a band. Like, what do you think it all meant? Like, how do you want this book to inspire other people? Like, is it just mostly perseverance or is there more lessons?
That's a really good question, and it's a very after you've read the book, you may have to sift through it again because there is a deeper and a persistent theme to the book, and that is that when you ultimately, everyone's in the process through life of defining themselves, trying to understand yourself. If you can't understand yourself, you really can't understand anything in the world. And that's something that I hope is not lost in the future, because to know thyself is the ultimate knowledge. But in order to do that is a very difficult thing. And I couched it in the search or the quest for understanding the origin of punk as a culture, and myself in that cultural milieu. And I did actually summarize it in the last pages when I said that in order to do that, you're going to have to identify the original punk. Who was it? Who's the original punk? And I said that the search for that's where the real quest in life is the journey, the search. And that's what we should celebrate, because luckily, especially with punk, that journey will lead to good things. And the good news is that the extinction of punk, that is the death of the end of the journey, is nowhere near in sight. So that's really an uplifting way to look at the end of the book too.
Absolutely. Well, I know you got to get going here. Last thing is, I always like to end with a charity, promoting a charity. Is there a charity that's near and dear to your heart that people can donate to after they buy your book?
Sure. I mean, I always like to, I'm pretty old fashioned when it comes to charity. I don't think that you necessarily can save the world by donating to something global. I think when it comes down to needs are usually seen in your own community. And if you can just help out people near and dear to you in your own community, that's the best thing you can do. So I always go for local food banks, and the food bank of the Southern Tier in New York is a worthy recipient.
Yeah, I think that's something we can all get behind, donating to food. Everybody needs food. Everybody can agree. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I know you got to get going, so I'll let you go. I really appreciate it. And good luck with this book. I think it's great. I think people should pick it up for sure.
Well, many thanks, and I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Bye, Greg.
Bye-bye.
My thanks to Greg Graffin and Bad Religion and his PR team. He's a legend, and I can't believe he did my show, but here we are. So I'm very grateful. I wish I had more time, but hopefully I can have him back again. I have a lot more questions to ask him. I would love to see him on Joe Rogan. I think that would be a fun back and forth. Make sure to get his new book, Punk Paradox. It's great stuff. Even if you aren't a fan of the music, it's just a good read of a regular guy's life. And I think all people have an interesting story to tell. That's why I've had almost 300 episodes of this show where everyone tells their story. And if you want to help support this episode and the show and Bad Religion, your likes, shares, and comments on social media will help the algorithm so more people will see it. And of course, make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen so you'll be the first to hear of new episodes. We've got some fun guests lined up, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for listening. Have a great rest of your day and shoot for the moon.